When It Was Saigon, Director's Cut, Episode 1, Welcome to Vietnam. Hi, Coach Gary Micheloni here, and welcome to the Human Voice Project, stories worth hearing. Because every voice has a story, and every story has a voice. So if you're a veteran or a student of history, or simply someone who believes the stories of those who served should never be forgotten, you're in the right place. Today, we're opening the pages of a remarkable anthology titled When It Was Saigon, compiled by U.S. Army veteran Chuck Dean. And I'm honored to have narrated the audiobook and now to welcome you as your host for this special 7-part Director's Cut series. This isn't simply an audiobook. It's an opportunity for us to spend a few minutes together before each group of stories, giving us a chance to meet the remarkable people behind them and to better appreciate the experiences they're about to share. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that all 7 episodes are already available here on YouTube, so you can continue the journey whenever you'd like. I do recommend beginning here with Episode 1 because Chuck's introduction provides an excellent overview of Vietnam and the war. Much like the orientation thousands of young Americans received when they first arrived in country. Like many Americans of my generation, I served during the Vietnam era. My Army assignment took me to South Korea instead of South Vietnam, something for which I've always been grateful. But many of the young men I went through basic training with weren't so fortunate. Some were sent to Vietnam and some never came home. I've never forgotten them. And as our nation marks its 250th anniversary, seems like an appropriate time to pause and listen to a generation that answered its country's call. Whatever our individual thoughts about the Vietnam War, I think we can all agree that the men and women who served deserve to have their stories heard. When I narrated this anthology, I discovered that these aren't simply stories about war. They're stories about people. Young Americans from different backgrounds, different branches of service, different walks of life, whose experiences shaped them forever. And that's why I wanted to create this director's cut, not to replace the audiobook, but to make these voices easier to discover, easier to share, and easier to remember. To make this series even more enjoyable, I've created a free director's cut companion guide. It features all 27 veterans you'll meet throughout this series, with photographs and background information to accompany the stories. To receive your free copy, simply stop by thehumanvoiceproject.com. We'd love to welcome you to the Human Voice Project community. But enough about me. I've got 3 veterans, great folks, that you just have to meet. Our first story is from Donald Pee Wee Clevenger, a truck driver with the U.S. Army's 529th Transportation Company. His story, The War We Heard About, reminds us that for many young Americans, Vietnam quickly became very different from what they'd imagined. Next, we'll meet Dana Morgan, a combat engineer with the United States Marine Corps. In Liberty Bridge and the Road to An Hoa, he gives us a glimpse into one of the many dangerous jobs that kept Marines moving forward. And our third story comes from Michael A. Harris, a radio man second class in the United States Navy, serving with the Mobile Riverine Force. His story, Connex Box Op, introduces us to another side of the Vietnam experience, life on the rivers of the Mekong Delta. 3 veterans, 3 branches of service, 3 different experiences, and 27 stories worth hearing. We'll begin with Chuck Dean's introduction to the anthology, followed by the first 3 stories. Thank you for joining me. Now, let's listen. Introduction. When we went to fight the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, Saigon was thought of as the French Riviera of the Orient. It definitely had that exotic European feel, but was pretty worn from wear when we got there. A combination of a tropical Asian backdrop and a protracted French influence had made it a place like no other. However, that was looking at it from the outside. Once you were inside, the city became an unbearably chaotic and filthy place that had its own set of dangers because it, too, was in the war zone. The noise and crowds failed to create a vibrancy of enjoyable life. All it did was cause it to be even more stifling and annoying. Consequently, we outsiders found it difficult most of the time to let down our guard while moving with the forces and flows that perpetuated in the city around the clock. Saigon seemed like it was designed to crush us rather than welcome us. But as bleak as that sounds, it was still the one vestige of refuge in the entire country where every troop longed to go for at least a little respite from combat areas. It seemed to be the only safe haven, like the eye of a storm, and supposedly where the war was not. There were hotels and beds with sheets and even ice for your drinks. Perhaps it was the closest reminder of home for hundreds of thousands of young Americans who were scattered in mountain fire bases, rice paddies, jungles, river bases, and countless other hostile countrysides during the war. 2,709,918 American troops served in Vietnam when Saigon was still Saigon. There are as many stories multiplied several times over, carried in the memories of every soldier, sailor, coastie, airman, and marine who served. Not all were gruesome tales or heroic encounters. Most were accounts that made them marvel or laugh at the moment they were in. Most are stories of ways to beat the routine boredom of daily experiences during a 12 or 13-month tour of duty. What we have heard mostly over the years has been the immense tragedy of that war. Moments of pain, suffering, and degradation have been the lot. Then, of course, we have all been brought into the light about PTSD. It has become the invisible wound characterized by the dark shadows lingering in souls of those who came home and tried to fit in again. For them, the transition was the most difficult march to make. Endless and aching, like shrapnel in the heart, there has been no way to fix it. We read about it more and more, and perhaps we will learn more and more, maybe enough to make a difference for the future. When news came on April 30th, 1975, that Saigon had fallen, captured by North Vietnamese forces, something snapped in every Vietnam veteran's heart. At that moment, we knew that Saigon was no longer that sacred place of retreat. The news screamed at us that it was finished. But somehow, it was easier to accept the fact that the war was lost than it was to have our iconic Saigon be ripped so suddenly from our lives. It was the end, and that city will never be the same as the one we knew. Here, within these pages, you will read a small smattering of a historical sojourn as told by many voices. None of us had identical experiences during the war, but as the kaleidoscope turns, it becomes a familiar landscape to us all. Every American alive during that era can easily relate to the overall mosaic portrayed on the canvas between the covers of this book. Some of the tales told are reminiscent of Michener's South Pacific, where American GIs demonstrate some very creative ways to entertain themselves and to see what they can get away with. Most of the featured writers here do not write as a vocation, but have told their stories with a simple, raw talent that's easy to identify with. They all address our common humanity, and they artfully compose a naturalness of discourse that inspires me to keep writing. If I am looking for some takeaway value from what they have written, it would be just that, a pure naturalness coming from my peers. Since we tried to keep an even balance in narration, all voices are done in the masculine. We hope this is acceptable to all and does not take away from the savor that each story holds. One remarkable byproduct from this collaborative project is the subtle healing that emerged unannounced. For some of the writers, it was the first time they found the words to describe a certain happening since coming home from the war. And talking about it has always been the first step on the long journey home. So, thank you, my fellow writers. This is not one person's book. It belongs to us all. The narratives found here are not so much about the pain and the suffering of serving in an unpopular war. They are simple accounts remembered and shared by ordinary people serving their country in extraordinary times. They are an assortment of essays about real-life happenings surrounded by the strain of war. Some read as reports of duty, some are humorous, and others are unbelievably intense, and they all happened when Saigon was still Saigon. Chuck Dean, editor. Additional copies of this book can also be obtained in paperback and digital Kindle formats from Amazon.com. Chapter 1. The War We Heard About. Donald Pee Wee Clevenger, truck driver, U.S. Army, 529th Transportation Company, light truck, Vietnam, 1967 to 1968. It was Monday, April 3rd, 1967, at Con Dong in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 3 months earlier, my entire unit, the 529th Transportation Company, had arrived in country after a 21-day ocean voyage aboard the USNS General Maurice Rose troopship. Our main home base was Phan Rang Air Base in Ninh Thuan Province on the coast of the South China Sea and near the Central Highlands. The base itself was located about 5 miles northwest of the small city of Phan Rang. While in country, our main mission was hauling supplies and men both for the U.S. Air Force and the 101st Airborne Division. We worked on 12-hour shifts, and every fourth day we worked a night shift on perimeter guard duty. For the most part, we only heard that there was a war going on. Don't get me wrong, though. We didn't go anywhere without our M14s and at least 100 rounds of ammo. Along with that, we were always alert of our surroundings, never letting our guard down by forgetting where we were. But for the most part, we felt pretty secure. I had been in Con Dong since March 28th, supporting the 101st in Operation Summerall. And after moving the unit into the area of operation, one squad of 10 trucks and 20 men stayed behind to continue supporting the units engaged. The rest of the company went back to Phan Rang. That particular day's job was to go by convoy to a mini-port about 40 miles west of there, hauling avgas, jet fuel, and ammo. The fuel was in 500-gallon rubber bladders. Accompanying the 10 trucks were 4 gun truck escorts, each fitted with 4 .50-caliber machine guns on a turret, the same that is used on boats. They were situated in the convoy between 2 of our deuce-and-a-halves, then a gun truck, and then another of ours, and so on. There was a jeep up front leading, and a couple of guys with metal detectors swept the road for mines. A small helicopter carrying the commander of the gun trucks flew overhead to direct and observe from the air. We had been driving along in pretty open country with no problems, and it seemed like just another day in the countryside when suddenly the jungle closed in around us, leaving just a narrow path of rough pavement for us to drive through. I remember thinking, if Charlie is going to hit us, this would be the place. We had been moving and stopping every so often to allow the minesweepers up ahead to do their work in clearing the road. And with all the potholes we had been running over, the guys clearing the road, and I'm guessing the commander and the chopper overhead, all had grave concerns that they were loaded with concealed explosives. We couldn't have gone more than a tenth of a mile through this jungle tunnel when all hell broke loose. Our convoy came to a complete halt, and we could hear machine gun fire coming at us. We couldn't see anything because of the close denseness of the jungle alongside the road, and then the gun trucks opened up. The one right behind my truck opened fire, and both my co-driver and I began pouring M14 rounds out in the open windows into the jungle. We couldn't see anything, no targets, no bodies, nothing to shoot but trees. We did know enough to return fire when in an ambush, a basic lesson to be used in war zone. When ambushed, always return fire, even if you can't find a target. If you just sit there, the enemy will keep pouring it on. So returning fire sends a message that you're not going to just lay down. You're going to put up a fight. It was all so amazing. When the 50s opened up, the smaller trees were actually falling like they were being cut down with the blade. I swear, you could hear the bladders full of fuel taking rounds, but luckily there were no leaks. I never knew why. I just assumed that they were self-sealing. The commander in the chopper overhead continued yelling commands on the radio to move the convoy, but the sweepers were too concerned about the mines in the road to pull out. So we sat there immobilized until the ambush was broken and things died down. In dangerous times, you can see the strangest things. In the heat of all the bullets flying, I sat and I watched a crazy photographer from the 101st jump up on a Jeep to shoot still photos until the bullets got too close, and then he would jump back down for a bit and then start all over again. What a job he had! I hope he got some good combat shots, or maybe even a medal or two for what he was doing. It seemed pretty crazy to me. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, but in reality was probably only a few minutes, the convoy started moving again. The clattering fire of AK-47s faded behind us as we pulled away and continued the rest of the journey to the mini-port. The word was that 2 of the 50 caliber machine guns had burned up 2 barrels while firing 10,000 rounds of ammo during the ambush. Our only injury sustained was that one of our guys burnt his hand after grabbing the hot barrel of his own rifle during the shooting. One truck took a round through the hood that hit an ejector line, but they pinched it off so we could make it back. At the mini-port, we dropped the bladders and ammo and then stood down for a welcome break before starting the journey back. None of us looked forward to a repeat. We were not too excited about going back through that jungle tunnel and maybe once again experiencing the war that we had only heard about. My co-driver took over for the injured driver in the other truck, and I drove alone on the return trip. And after a few silent prayers and thanking the good Lord that we were still alive, we started back. It was so odd. On the return trip from the mini-port, we drove once again through the ambush area where it happened, and all was quiet and we had no problems. We only thought it was weird that all the spent cartridge casings left all over the ground had disappeared. They had been picked up by the enemy to be used against our troops sometime in the future. And as I drove along, I became aware of a new reality. As a result of the ambush that I had experienced, I was now jumpier than I had ever been before in my life. I realized it when about halfway on the return trip there was a loud bang and then a rumble. I almost came out of my skin, and the first thought that entered my mind was, God, here we go again. And then I realized it was just thunder and lightning ushering in another storm across the horizon. I had 9 long months yet to go. Donald Pee Wee Clevenger was drafted into the U.S. Army in December of 1965. After receiving training to operate wheeled vehicles, jeeps, trucks, etc., he was deployed by ship from Oakland, California, to Vietnam in December of 1966. His unit went ashore at Cam Ranh Bay and was then based at Phan Rang. He is a retired mill worker and married with 1 daughter. He and his wife, Linda, live in Morton, Washington. Chapter 2, Liberty Bridge and the Road to Anhoi. Dana Morgan, USMC, Combat Engineer, D Company, 7th Engineer Battalion, 1st Marine Division. This is no more than a day in the life of a combat engineer. My MOS was 1371, combat engineer. Constructing and maintaining roads and bridges in a combat zone can be sort of tricky for an engineer. You learn fast how to multitask, or things can go quite badly for you. Not only do engineers have to keep supply lines open, sweep for mines, and generally keep things running for everyone else, they also have to keep from being killed by the enemy while working. In August 1965, my unit, the 7th Engineer Battalion, arrived for service in Vietnam. From Da Nang, the battalion supported the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, MAF, throughout the I Corps Tactical Zone. During the following year, the battalion had constructed an M4 aluminum pontoon bridge spanning 1,478 feet over the Da Nang River, the longest ever built. In 1968, Company D participated in Operation Mameluke Thrust and had the awesome task of supplying over 33 million gallons of fresh water to the Marines of 3rd MAF. We did all this while avoiding ambushes, snipers, and improvised explosive devices. One of our daily duties was to sweep and clear certain roads of mines and booby traps between Marine positions. Nearly every day was filled with an assortment of dramatic incidences. Our company had platoons sweeping a 10-mile stretch of road between our base camp and the An Hoa combat base, starting at opposite ends of the road and then meeting somewhere close to the middle. Along the road where the two teams met, the enemy would mine the area more heavily, and several Marines were lost due to mines. We lost 2 dump trucks and a bulldozer, plus our casualties, in 1 week. The Marine Corps solution was to put a fire base at that very spot, so we went to work and pushed up an earth perimeter, laid barbed wire, and then helped build bunkers. It was always weird how quickly things would happen, too, because the very night of the day we finished this one fire base, the enemy tried to overrun the position. Mortars supplied illumination all night long with HE, and Puff the Magic Dragon, an AC-47, would supply air cover. At one point in that night, the enemy did breach the perimeter, and things took a turn, and it went to hand. No Marines were hurt in this incident, and the assault was repelled. At daybreak, 19 enemy bodies were found in the wire, and utilizing one of our bulldozers, we dug a trench to bury them. Then we saddled up for the next task. We usually left our position at sunrise to avoid the heat, and this one day seemed no different than any other. The sun continued to rise as we went past the little villages outside our perimeter. Finally, the presence of kids looking for oranges and candy began to dwindle as we moved further out, and it was just us on the road. We arrived at a place known as Liberty Bridge, located at the junction of the Thu Ban and Bujia rivers, and it looked like business as usual. There was an infantry camp on one side of the river, and an artillery battery across the river on an elevated area known to us as Phuloc 6. The bridge had been damaged by a fire and it was impassable, so our bridge company ran a ferry to facilitate bridge traffic. As we approached the ferry landing, we could hear a lot of shooting, and as we looked across at the artillery side of the river, we saw that the entire compound had been overrun. Looking closer, we saw no Americans inside the wire, and there appeared to be hundreds of Viet Cong running throughout the artillery area. Our radio man called our captain for instructions, who then simply ordered us to cross the river and do Marine stuff and kick their ass. Being a typical combat engineer, the radio man replied, "But skipper, we're lovers, not fighters." That didn't play well with the captain because he didn't respond on the radio, confirming to us that the CO most likely thought the radio man was too dumb to converse with. So we prepared to do the Marine stuff, and we boarded the ferry And just as we were about to head across the river, we heard something overhead, and it was an artillery barrage coming in from 175-millimeter howitzers. They unloaded several air bursts, which unleashed what appeared to be balls that bounced up from the ground and then exploded like grenades. After the arty had softened up the area, we were told to saddle up, and with no plan whatsoever, we assaulted the hill. There was a little beach and then a road to the perimeter, and as we jumped off the ferry, screaming and yelling all the way to the top where the artillery pieces were situated, we came to an abrupt halt. All was quiet when we got there. No Viet Cong, just blood trails and flechettes from the artillery scattered around. I can't say that I was disappointed that no one was home, and I could feel a sigh of relief from the other men around me. My heart was in my throat from all the adrenaline. The prospect of an untimely demise from our own artillery being manned by the enemy was not something that any of us relished. From there, we went back to being combat engineers, looking for booby traps in all the artillery boxes and sweeping every bunker and place where there might be a hidden surprise for other Marines. After a few hours we finished, and fortunately for us, and much to our relief, in their haste the enemy did not take the time to booby-trap the area before pulling out. And then a bizarre thing happened. Around 09:30, a helicopter landed, and some Marines jumped off the chopper and began setting up a tent with a field kitchen. They cooked up a real breakfast for all of us. Real bread, real eggs, cooked to order, home fries and Canadian bacon, even fresh orange juice. It was great. I've never had a breakfast that was so superior in taste. As I watched the cooks work, I had to grin as they kept glancing over their shoulder as if they were going to get shot at any moment. None of them had ever been so far away from base camp. And while we ate, one of my friends from boot camp showed up. He was with a tank unit that arrived to provide added security for us as we went about our work. Not only was it good to see him, but we loved him even more for what he toted with him. He had a small cooler with cold beer and shared what he had. Between that and the breakfast, we were golden. As we sat eating, there was a single Willie Peter explosion in the distance, but nothing else happened, so we thought little of it. However, a bit later, some young people carried a wounded Vietnamese civilian into the compound. As we saddled up and moved out, he was still there waiting for the medevac, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was not one of the VC that had overrun the artillery position. One never knew in that war. Liberty Bridge was somewhat of a landmark for all of us. The Seabees first constructed it in 1966 and 1967, and ever after, the enemy had tried to demolish it with fire, mortars, or floating explosives up against it, then detonating them. They succeeded several times, and even our own troops unintentionally set it on fire accidentally from time to time. In retrospect, this thing cost millions of dollars for materials and the number of times it had to be rebuilt. Figured in were the lives lost during construction, plus all the Marines lost on operations to protect it. Today, there are only a couple pilings left. The rest of the structure had been burnt to the waterline during the war. As for me, my relationship with Liberty Bridge began this way. It was my very first day on the job, and we were headed for the bridge. As we drew close, we started receiving incoming fire. It was an ambush. At first, I had no idea what was happening, but everyone else was already down in the ditch on the opposite side of the road. So once I got my head and back end wired together, I was there with them. Due to my friend and his tank outfit arriving on the scene, the ambush was broken and it was over with. Immediately, we were ordered to saddle up and get moving like nothing had happened. Welcome to Vietnam. I found out later that the day before our ambush, the sweep team had caught a ride back to our base camp and ran over a mine in the very same spot we had been ambushed. Unfortunately, 3 Marines were killed and several wounded. Reflecting on those times, I believe that when most of us went to Nam, we had great compassion and expectations for good. What we had learned as children about caring for others and knowing right from wrong was in our hearts. Unfortunately, most of it went out the window and wrong became right and vice versa. Saddle up became a word of significance for most of us too. Saddle up meant you had to push aside whatever was on your mind and carry on. Not only did it mean that we were moving out, it also meant that we needed to focus on what was ahead and not look back. No matter what happened, or who was killed, or who got put on a medevac, it all had to be contained to think about later. Inside, we felt it was good to just saddle up because we didn't have to concern ourselves with the reality of what was happening at the time. We could just walk on and think that perhaps none of this was even happening. Well, this is only good for so long, because when the downtime comes and you're all alone thinking, it becomes a different kind of reality. As I write this, in about 2 weeks' time, it will be the 50th anniversary of my trip to Vietnam. The experience has shaped my thinking for the past 50 years. As I reflect on it now, I may have been traveling on the road to An Hoa back then, but now I can see how going to Vietnam has been the road I will travel the rest of my life. I miss my friends and will always remember them. Dana Morgan grew up in a small town in western New York. The week before high school graduation, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The day after graduation, he was on the train to Paris Island and arrived in Vietnam 5 months later. He came home, was married a year later, and went to college at night, obtaining a business degree. He became the general manager at his place of employment. He oversaw a division of a large multinational corporation. During that time, he and his wife had 2 children. Around 1989, things came to a head when PTSD interfered with his job and everything went downhill. He heard about a conference in Virginia Beach where he met Chuck Dean, and that was a turning point for the rest of his life. He became involved in Point Man International Ministries and has been the president and CEO since 1999. He lives at home with his wife Susan. They have 5 granddaughters. Chapter 3, Connex Box Op. Michael A. Harris, U.S. Navy. Radio Man, 2nd Class, RM2. Mobile Riverine Force, Task Force 117, River Assault Squadron 15, River Assault Division 152, Boat T-152-1, Vietnam 768 to 769. Our river assault boats were in Dong Tam for a routine overhaul. It meant rearming, repairs, painting, and other assorted duties. Our boat had a wobble in her starboard shaft, so the engine men had lifted her out of the water onto a pontoon and were replacing it. It was nice to be off the rivers for a while, a little stand down from the combat. The sun was lingering over the palm fronds as we headed to the Navy Enlisted Club after a long day's work. The thought of a few cool beers was inviting. Maybe the Viet Cong would give us a break by not sending in their rockets and mortars. The Navy Club was unique. You could arrive pretty early, like 0900, for a few breakfast beers. Just when you got a good buzz going, they would close down around 1200 hours, so everyone would have to go eat lunch or take a nap. Then you could return after they reopened in the afternoon and drink to your heart's content, providing you didn't get too rowdy. The club was not a very big place. I would guess maybe 40 feet by 30 feet. As you walked in, the bar was on your right, the toilet was on the left. We only needed one since there were no round-eyed women in that area. Then the far end of the bar opened up into a larger area that housed a couple of pool tables and a jukebox. Our commander-in-chief, President LBJ, was there hanging behind the bar, along with some river assault squadron patches and a naval support activity Detachment Dong Tom logo painted on a piece of plywood. A few weeks earlier, Bob and I had been in the club for a few beers when a group of River Assault Squadron 9 sailors showed up. You'd think that we had our hands full fighting the enemy, right? Evidently not. Toss in a couple of different squadrons, some alcohol, and you have a volatile situation. On that night, an argument broke out around the pool table between some RAS-9 and RAS-15 sailors. One thing led to another, and all of a sudden pool sticks were swinging, cue balls were flying, and people were jumping around everywhere. Bob and I grabbed our cold ones and backed up to the nearest wall to watch the action. It afforded an excellent opportunity to grab a couple of deserted beers from the nearby table as well. After about 20 minutes, the shore patrol arrived and stopped the melee just when it was going good. Adrenaline and hormones were spewing everywhere. The next morning, several sailors had some explaining to do. When we arrived that day, the after-lunch crowd had things hopping. The jukebox was cranked, and we got right into the mood. The bartender made it clear that he didn't want to see any crap, and we all agreed. I walked away thinking, how the heck does an enlisted person get a job like this? As the night wore on, we loosened up nicely. Our choice of beer was Carling Black Label, Falstaff, Budweiser, and Schlitz, I think. This was around the time the Pop Tops came out, but none of the beers in Vietnam had them. We used church keys, K-bars, P38s, or anything that would get them open without causing a big fizz. After a few months in the constant humidity, our consumption rate increased immensely. The more you drank, the more you sweated, so you had to drink to avoid dehydration. At least that was one of our excuses. Earlier in the day, I had passed by a man as he was unlocking a Connex box. These were metal boxes about 8 feet wide by 8 feet deep and 7 feet high. One side had double doors that latched in the middle with a big iron rod and hasp. They were used to ship equipment and other goods into Vietnam. They were also good for stopping smaller pieces of shrapnel. I glanced over his shoulder and noted that the entire box was full of beer. There must have been 100 cases in there. I sauntered on like I hadn't noticed anything, but a plan began to develop right away. Emergency resources were always good to have, whether they were yours or someone else's. By the time the club closed, we were all very sloshed. I had been telling Bob and Joe about my plan. They liked it. What could they do to us if we got caught? Send us to Vietnam? It couldn't get any worse than it was. Once outside, we huddled around a bunker, refining our tactics. There was a huge, well-lit warehouse with a sentry. He was packing heat to the tune of an M16. Small weaponry. However, for us riverine sailors that were accustomed to doling out plenty of hurt with our assorted weaponry routinely, it was a very small change indeed. As part of the plan, I just happened to know where a forklift was kept. Being the perpetrator, I took charge. Bob's assignment was to distract the sentry on the other side of the warehouse so he wouldn't notice our clandestine operation being pulled off. Joe became the replacement sentry so that he could keep an eye on everything and sound the alarm if anyone wandered into our area of operation. I was the forklift driver. The one problem is that we forgot to plan out where we were going to take the Connex box. Joe and I watched Bob's lanky figure disappear behind the warehouse. Being a jovial guy, Bob would have no problem with the sentry. Soon, the sentry rode around the other direction on his bicycle. We waited a few minutes, and then Joe ran over to the opposite corner of the warehouse to his position. I jumped on the forklift. I'd driven farm machinery while bucking hay, so I figured I knew what I was doing. But I didn't take into account how inebriated I was. And after climbing up onto the seat of the forklift, I located the key and the starter button. She cranked over nicely as I pumped on the pedal. No ignition. I checked a couple more things and then began cranking once again. The noise was awesome as she fired up. Vroom, vroom. I grinned broadly and began grinding gears. I was sure that no one in the adjacent barracks even knew what was happening. While continuing to grind gears, I heard a faint sound to my left. The vibration of the machine had me bouncing around. Finally, I looked in that direction. I couldn't believe it. There stood a shore patrol dude yelling at me. I cupped my hand to one ear and hollered, "What?" He began giving me the slicing hand across his throat. I shut the girl down. She lurched and coughed before becoming silent. The SP was still screaming as if the machine was still running, and then lowered his voice a notch or two. "Get the hell down here." I stumbled to the ground with great confidence and was sure he would understand. Much to my surprise, he didn't understand me at all. I tried to tell him that a tablet wasn't necessary, but he kept writing anyway. He was asking questions like, "What's your name? What unit are you with?" etc. As he was writing, I'll be darned if Bob didn't ride by behind him on the sentry's bicycle. It had a piece of metal welded on it with a number cut into it. I did my best to keep from laughing, but failed. Bob made a second pass, waving both hands in the air, and I busted a gut. This made the SP madder than hell. He kept asking me what I was laughing about because he had no clue that Bob was behind him. I looked over, and Joe stood at the corner of a barracks, doubled over as well. Falling off to sleep was not much of a problem when we finally hit the rack. Waking up later that morning with a vague memory of the night was a little more difficult. As I swung my feet to the floor, I noticed a chit lying on top of my jungle fatigues. A closer look, and I knew I was screwed. I had to be at Chief So-and-so's office at 0830. I looked at my watch, and the sun was already baking the tin roof at 0815, and I needed water badly, and it became my first mission. Cottonmouth had taken over my entire oral cavity. As I walked into the chief's office wearing my best tattered greens, I was met by a young clerk who told me where to wait. I made sure that I wore my beret with my unit patch, hoping that the man would understand. It could go either way because I knew he was not a river assault boat sailor. Finally, I heard him bark. "Get in here, Petty Officer Harris." I staggered in, trying not to appear hungover. He looked as gruff as his voice. "What the hell did you think you were doing last night, sailor?" I said, "Truth?" He answered with, "You're damned right." I proceeded to tell him about the plan and the need for more beer after the club closed. And in the middle of my confession, I got this sinking gut feeling that he would never understand or have any compassion. But I was in for a surprise. After giving me a few more choice words, he looked me square in the eyes and asked, "Did you just come off the rivers?" "Yes," I replied. He slowly shook his head and then shot his arm straight at the door and bellowed, "Get the hell out of my office, and if I ever see your face in here again, your ass will be in big trouble." My legs almost buckled as I did a quick about-face and headed for the door. A wry smile was on my face as I passed the surprised clerk, and after the screen door slammed behind me, I pumped a fist in the air a few times and headed for my 0900 breakfast at the club. It was going to be another fine day in the Mekong Delta. Michael Harris entered Navy boot camp in June 1967. During Radioman A School, he volunteered for riverboats. He then underwent small boat training at the Naval Inshore Operations Training Center at Vallejo, California, with gunnery training at Camp Roberts, California, and SEER School at Whidbey Island, Washington. Upon arrival in country in late July 1968, he joined the Mobile Riverine Force, Task Force 117, and he was assigned to River Assault Squadron 15 and Division 152, 50 caliber machine gunner on board an armored troop carrier, ATC, or Tango T-152-1. His tour was completed in mid-July 1969. Michael is the recipient of the Bronze Star with V device for his action in Vietnam. He is a retired general building contractor, Christian missionary, and veteran service representative. He and his wife live in Oregon.